My name is Midnight. I am the Executive Director of APCOM. A very warm welcome to our pre-conference session of the RAPCON 2020, which is part of our week-long APCOM Community Summit 2020. Thank you so much for tuning in to this session. The Rights, Resource and Resilience Asia-Pacific Community Conference, or as we call it, RAPCON 2020, aims to provide a regional platform for key populations and LGBTQI community to discuss and share important innovations, updates, and lessons learned on HIV and human rights, and then of course the effect of COVID-19. We are operating in this COVID-19 era, and better coordination is needed amongst the community. The RAPCON 2020 also aims to enable community partners to effectively manage and engage with national programs, as well as scaling up the roles they play. What you need to know. And we have a very well sought after speaker and long-term friend of APCOM, Laurindo Garcia. Laurindo is an HIV positive LGBTQ community organizer who has worked with groups in Australia, Asia, North Africa, and the US. As the founder of the Be Inclusive, he operates in the registry of inclusive business that includes over 200 companies, and his clients I have included Airbnb, Levi Strauss, and Salesforce. Laurindo was elected as a Ashoka Fellow in 2015 and won the Singtel Future Makers competition in 2018. We will have some time for Q&A after Laurindo shares some of his experiences and tips on engaging the private sector. Laurindo, over to you.
Thank you, Midnight, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be back with APCOM, and without further ado, I'm just going to jump into the presentation, so we've got a lot of time for questions and conversation later on. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and here we go. All right, so yes, so the session is what you need to know for engaging the private sector for funding. As Midnight mentioned, I'm a long-term friend of APCOM. I used to work full-time in advocacy from 2007 through to sorry, I forgot that. Just do that here. Having a bit of a technical problem. Is it still sharing? Okay. And I'm thrilled to be part of the RAPCON conference and kicking things off. So my intention in this session is to share tactics that I've learned since I pivoted from running a not-for-profit organization in 2016 to commercial model looking for social impact. Over the last 4 years, I've learned to pitch before private sector investors in the United States, in Europe, and also across Asia. I've sent numerous commercial proposals for services to be offered to companies. I've conducted crowdfunding campaigns, entered in competitions, and attended many boot camps. And so I thought it would be helpful to share what I've learned. And also just to kind of connect some of the dots here. I mean, yes, Midnight mentioned that I had been elected an Ashoka Fellow as a global part of their fellowship of social entrepreneurs, but I was also one of the key people that secured global funding for the Aishan Hivos program in 2011. And I was also, in my previous organization, I was also one of the partners in the Being LGBT in Asia initiative as well. Okay, so so just to give you a bit of an overview of what you can expect today, we're gonna, as we navigate this online platform, some of the key points that we'll cover. In a minute, we're gonna have a bit of an icebreaker just to make sure that we serve your needs throughout the session. I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that some community organizations and groups are facing. I'll present what are potential solutions that are in the private sector funding space, and also give you some tips on how to implement some of these strategies as well. And before we wrap up the session, we'll have lots of time for questions and conversation. But first, a bit of an icebreaker. Again, I'd like to make sure that this session addresses some of the needs that you may have. And so what I'd like you to do is look for the chat window on the online session platform. And I invite you to answer these two questions. So the first question is, what are your expectations from this session? And the second question is, what is the most important issue that you want answered and addressed before the end of the hour? And my intention here is really to get a sense of what you're thinking, what your needs are, and I want to do my best to try and wrap up the session by having addressed all of these. So I'm going to just break out of the sharing for a moment and just see if we've got any questions that are coming in on the comments right now. Don't worry if you haven't got anything that comes to mind right now. I'll be checking in with the comments later on. But if you do have any questions, any specific ideas that you're needing advice on, then please feel free just to throw them into the chat window, and then we'll make sure that we go through them along. So while we wait for some things to come through, I'll just jump straight back into the presentation. Okay, so okay. So what are some of the challenges that community organizations are facing? So I know this from experience. Funding is always a sensitive and hot topic for yourselves, community organizers, community leaders as well. But there are two key areas that you may be facing right now. On one hand, you may not have enough funding to cover things outside of the programs that you've got funding for from your existing donors, particularly for overhead costs and institutional expenses. And the second thing is that the future is uncertain. We live in a time when many of the global and regional organizations are facing a funding crunch. Yes, there may be some optimism with the recent elections in the United States, but there's lots of questions about what the future looks like. So again, existing funding from traditional donors may be uncertain, and so you may be asking yourself, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to navigate out of this? So I'd like to present a potential solution and see how the private sector could play a role in addressing some of those problems. Right. So funding from the private sector generally takes two forms. Either, number one, in the form of corporate giving, in the form of donations, so that's one side of things. But the other type of funding that not a lot of community organizations think about, which is how goods that they create or services that they provide could be offered in return for fees, right? And so, but those are the two main areas, the main channels for funding from the private sector. Your donor or your client may be a small, medium enterprise or a large corporation or a multinational. And I want to make the distinction between large corporations and multinationals for one key reason is that when I say large corporations, I'm talking about domestic corporations that may be corporations in Thailand, or corporations that are Singaporean owned, where I am at the moment, or the big brands that may be that may have been operating in your country for a very long time, but aren't necessarily operating outside of your country, or maybe just in your specific region. And that's distinct from the Facebooks, the Googles, the Johnson & Johnsons, the Procter & Gamble's, all of those multinational companies. And the reason why I make a distinction is because, as we're going to discuss, many of the multinationals have a much greater tradition or culture of supporting and doing business with community organizations, particularly organizations doing work in the LGBTQIA space and also the HIV space. And whereas the domestic corporations may just be starting out or may have never done any of this type of work before. And so therefore, the approach is going to be a little bit different. There is a third way of getting funding from the private sector, which is in impact investment. But impact investment is beyond the scope of today's discussion. So when you may be asking yourself, when is private sector funding the right thing for your organization? Here are some things that might help you figure that out. The first thing I do want to say is that my recommended rule of thumb is never leave private sector funding to the last minute, because it always takes much longer to secure than you anticipate. So always try to be thinking in advance. So if you are kind of projecting into the future and thinking of private sector funding, then here are some 4 questions that might help you figure out if your organization is at the right stage to be able to go out and pitch for private sector funding. So the first is, are you able to offer something in exchange for the funding that you're asking for? That could be the audience that your community organization has access to, that perhaps that company does not have access to. Perhaps you've got expertise that you can offer to that company, or perhaps they're looking for some tax breaks that's in the form of donations that come as a result of offering donations. So that's number 1. The second one is, what type of corporate structure do you have? And does your corporate structure match the minimum requirements of that company? So some of the bigger companies, or even the multinationals, only give donations to companies that are registered charities, whereas the smaller, small-medium enterprises are a bit more flexible in who they give money donations to. But whatever the case may be, you need to kind of figure out if you've got the right setup for your organization to do that. And depending on where you're at with your setup, then that will kind of define who you're asking money from. The third one is in relation to time. So nobody's going to give money to you if they don't know you. So you need to be prepared to build relationships and maintain those relationships over time, because what we found is, just like with many of the donors, is that if you build a strong relationship that delivers meaningful and material results, then they'll often be willing to invest again, or give again, or buy your services again over time. So really think about how you could be, putting in the time to cultivate those relationships. And finally, it's about flexibility. In my experience, companies have been prepared to pay the most for things that are customized for them. So that could be like a training, or a lunch and learn session, or even some content that you're creating specifically for them. They're less likely to pay a premium if you're giving them something that you're offering them something that every other company has. And so again, they are willing to pay for customization. And so that means that as an organization, if you're going to be offering something to them, then you need to be flexible enough to be able to tailor it according to their needs. So you've already decided you want to approach companies for private sector funding. You've worked out what your strengths and weaknesses in relation to the type of organization that you are currently in, and now you may be asking yourself, well, how do I then go out there and get this cash, right? So I'm going to go through some 3 steps. The first one is in relation to creating a plan, right? Think of it like you're going out shopping, right? You're doing your weekly or your regular grocery shop, right? Basically, people generally recommend that before you step into the store, you figure out what you want to buy, you write yourself a shopping list, because if you don't, oftentimes you may forget to buy things, or you may buy things that you regret. And so planning things in advance is just generally a good thing to do. So planning is also useful in doing private sector funding engagement. And so here are 3 things that I'd like you to consider. So first of all, really put down on paper, get together with other people in your organization and your board members and figure out, what are your fundraising goals for the next year, for the next 2 years, right? When do you need that funding, and how are you going to achieve those plans? Even if those plans change, that's fine, but really just lay out that blueprint of what are your objectives, when do you need it, and how are you going to, and how do you assume that you are going to achieve those goals? And that's really critical, so then you at least have a framework for you to have these discussions with the companies, and you know the boundaries within which you can make some changes. The second thing is to do a little bit of market analysis, work out in your local area, in your city, in your country, which are the brands that are active, which are the brands that are active in terms of philanthropy or donations, which are the brands that are active in the LGBTQ space, if any, which are the brands that are active in the HIV space or the health space. But really kind of just do a little bit of a mapping analysis to work out which are the brands, and then make that distinction, which are the ones that are small to medium enterprises, perhaps they're the ones working in your geographic local area, as opposed to the national domestic corporations, and also the multinational corporations as well. Which of the multinationals have an office in your city? Figure these things out, and they'll help you formulate your game plan. The third piece is about analyzing the context that you have, or analyzing the context of your staff, your board members, the people in your inner circle. Oftentimes, it's going to be through word of mouth and people who know people that you'll be able to get your foot in the door and have a meeting with somebody at a corporation. And so it's best for you to kind of map out that heat map of who you have contacts with. The output raising plan that's aligned with your organization strategies, and also have that market analysis as well as your map, your analysis of your influence in your network. The next piece, then my next suggested course of action is then to network, right? To make friendly first contact with people either at a small, medium enterprise or at a corporation. And I'd encourage you to offer people the chance to have a coffee with them, and you actually do buy the coffee. It's, put aside a little bit of money to do this engagement work. But I think it's really important for you to at least go out there with the intention of you're offering somebody something, a coffee or tea, or even a meal if you're willing to offer it, in exchange for something else. I mean, that's how business works, right? And also the other rule of thumb in this first contact is never ask for money. Never ask for money on the first date. That's not what you're there for. Yes, that may be in the back of your mind, but never ask for money on that first date. And the reason why that's important is because, well, number one, it's just going to make it very uncomfortable for the people who you've invited, especially if you're just getting to know them, and it really changes the tone of the conversation, right? So in this first conversation, you're really there to learn about them. it's an opportunity for them to talk about what they do at their company, and also for you to share a little bit about yourself as well, and really getting to know each other. And so that's why offer that first coffee, make time to learn about them, and that whole first conversation is all about them and letting them shine and letting them talk about what is important for their company. So the strategies or the questions that you may be asking in this first conversation may be a little bit different depending on the size of the company. So for small, medium enterprises, you may be asking them not only what to share a little bit about their business, but also how have they invested in the local community? Are they investing in sports teams? Are they investing in any community groups? Or are they investing in any? Have they invested in any relief efforts in the past? And just find out about how they operate and how they see their role in supporting local communities. For the larger corporations, there's an opportunity, particularly the multinationals, for you to be asking about their employee resource groups. Now, if you've never heard of an employee resource groups, think of it this way. You've got a large corporation that has anywhere between 500 employees to 3,000 employees or even more, right? And with a lot of these larger corporations, they have what is called a employee resource groups. It's kind of like an internal peer support group that are set up for female employees or working parents, or older, relatively older employees, and more recently also LGBT employees, employees with disabilities, employees that are expats, and so on. And so asking about, framing your conversation with a representative of a larger corporation around, can you tell me about your employee resource group, on how long they've been set up and what are they doing? And just frame your conversation around that, and you'll find that they've always got something to share, and that can give you some ideas about what your entry points may be for your proposal. So again, the outcome that you're looking for at this stage is really just knowledge about the community initiatives that these companies are investing in, whether they're a small, medium enterprise or a larger corporation. Moving on, we come time to the pitch, right? And if and when you're at that time where you feel you've got something that you want to propose, maybe you've been invited to propose something after that first coffee, or maybe you've seen an open call for proposals, or whatever the case may be, you feel confident that you are ready to propose something, right? I'll go into feedback in a minute, but basically just some key tips on the proposal side of things. These are not donor proposals to United Nations, to USAID, or anything like this, right? The corporate private sector space really, time is money, right? They don't have time to read a 20-page proposal, nor are they looking for it. What generally I aim for is to create a proposal that's 2 pages long, nothing more. Yes, you can have some supporting documentation in an appendix, but basically you've got the what is it, why, how, and how much within 2 pages, and also the timeline, all within 2 pages, and let that lead the discussion, right? And they'll always have questions around that, but basically you're trying to give the essential information in those 2 pages, right? In those 2 pages, it's critical that you explain how the company is going to benefit from what it is that you have to offer in measurable and meaningful ways. So that may be a training that you're offering. That could be a lunch and learn session where you're talking about what it's like to be LGBT. It can be, you're offering promotion by sponsorship. If that company offers your organization sponsorship, then how many eyeballs are they going to be able to reach by being a sponsor of your organization? But basically, you're making it crystal clear in that proposal what the company will get out of this deal. The third thing to remember is that if you are submitting this proposal because you need money tomorrow or next week, then that's already too late. most companies, except for small, medium enterprises, will generally take around 4 to 6, sometimes 3 months to get the necessary approvals to sign off on your proposal. Right, and that's also depending on the amount of money that you're asking for. If you're asking for $1,000, then generally that could be much faster than if you're asking for $1 million. But the bigger the organization, the more people that your contact has to ask for approval. And sometimes those smaller amounts are even harder. So really give yourself enough time, lead time, that accounts for the multiple approvals that that your contacts will have to face. But as I said, for a small, medium enterprise, you're likely going to be talking to either the founder, the owner of the company, or at least somebody who's higher up. And because of the fact that they're smaller, they can generally make decisions much faster than a larger corporation. But then again, their ability to pay is actually much smaller because they don't have the deep pockets that a larger corporation does have, right? So the output that we're looking for in this stage isn't necessarily the funding. I would say that funding would be great to have, but what you're looking for at this stage is really exposure in the market, exposure and understanding of what companies are looking for. And you can only learn these things by sending multiple proposals out to companies and getting no's and asking for feedback. You know, why didn't this proposal fit what your company is looking for? Ask for this feedback. You're going to get a lot of rejections, unfortunately, but all of these things will ultimately lead to you having the business and market insight to help you refine those proposals down the track so you can have better success down the track. So really, at this stage, you're looking for exposure in the market to help you better understand what companies are looking for. Now, let's be clear. I mean, private sector funding is not for everyone, right? And you know, if you are a community group that's not registered, it's going to be a little bit tough, right? In the same vein, if you're a much larger corporation, a much larger organization as well, you've probably been doing this for a long time. So this type of work isn't necessarily for everyone. And as I said before, it's also a very long process as well. So just be prepared for that. These private sector funding is definitely not a silver bullet. And I would argue that you kind of need a mixture of both your current philanthropic funding or funding from international development agencies, as well as private sector funding. And a mixture of the two just will help you weather any uncertainties that happen in the future. Also, another thing, you know, let's be clear, you know, companies are not charities. They are interested in only one thing, which is making money. Sure, they may be claiming, at least through their marketing and their publicity, that they are out to make the world a better place. But let's be realistic. At the end of the day, they're out to make money. They are not charities. And so we need to kind of be prepared for that because, yeah, it's a different way of doing things. So let's do a little bit of a quick recap. I'm going to check in with any questions or comments and see if we can respond to any of the questions that are coming in. Questions so far? No? Okay, so...
Hi. No questions as yet, Laurindo, but I have lots of notes that I know a lot of the community groups would like to ask you, but maybe too shy. So I'll do that later as well. Yeah.
Sure. Well, why don't we dive in and handle those now?
Okay. All right. So thanks for that presentation. Really great to kind of hear all your tips. And I think what has been really nice to hear is that you've got both the NGO experience from when you were working with communities and, of course, funding for the Global Fund as well for Ashanibos. And then now, you know, having the experience in terms of the corporate doing all those work. There seems to be a lot of investment into the kind of like time and the marketing. And for NGOs, we don't have like a person who does marketing. How would you then suggest for people to start doing something, even though they might not have all the plans in place or the time to have coffees with many of these SMEs or corporates, but they want to start doing something? What would be your tips?
Yeah. I mean, time is always the tough. It's always a limited resource, right? So I think that there's two parts of your question. So number one is about marketing, and the other one is about the time just to do the outreach. And I want to handle those two things differently. I'm not saying that a community organization has to invest a lot into marketing itself and marketing itself as a brand. If that's not what your organization is intended to do, then you don't necessarily have to do that, right? Really only do what is right for your organization. So let me just make that clear. That being said, having some visibility about what your organization does is important. It will help make those conversations with that company a little bit easier. And visibility is important, not just for having a reputation when you're speaking to a company, but also for your beneficiaries and your donors as well. They're also wanting you as an organization to be amplifying and talking about the work that you do, advocating for specific issues. And so that could be social media feeds, getting out there on not only Facebook and Instagram, but also on LinkedIn as well. Although it's a completely different animal. We could talk about LinkedIn in a moment. But really doing the visibility that's needed for you as an organization, and not specifically just to do outreach for the private sector. Right, so that's number one. The second piece, which you asked about, which is about doing the outreach itself. Generally, I would encourage for the founder or the executive director to be doing this outreach. It's kind of, perhaps you could be sending out your other managers to find you some leads, but generally, you're going to need to be able to have the authority and the ability to talk around a number of different issues in these coffee meetings with your contact at these companies. But I can put a caveat in there. I mean, it's more often than not, if you're speaking to a small medium enterprise, you're going to be speaking to the owner or the one of the senior management team. So you're going to be needing to meet people who are of the same kind of position, right? But if you're reaching out to a multinational and you are talking to the person who is the lead of the employee resource group, then that need not be the executive director. That could be one of your program managers. And at least they're meeting again at the same level. And they are basically, I guess, working together to tie up another meeting where their senior leaders meeting your senior leader. And so that's how you're doing it that way. Yes, it takes time, but rather than thinking about it as, well, I don't have time to do this, you're thinking about it in the sense of, what new opportunities could this be opening up for my organization? How could a partnership with company X help us get closer to our targets for this year? And thinking about it that way, and perhaps rather than doing it when you don't have time, planning for when you do have time, right? And so just approaching it that way.
Thanks, Laurindo. Just to kind of expand on your answer on the kind of the visibility, I suppose, particularly for community organizations. I guess our visibility has been very much more with the reports that goes directly to donors every quarter or semester or every year, and that kind of sits on a shelf or in a file. So yeah, I agree. Like, how do you take that information and then take that out to other people and say, this is what you're doing under different projects, and really make that more visible, not just thinking that it's only for particular donors. This is something that they can then use that as a way to get the visibility locally and at the regional, or specifically for some of the corporates or SMEs that are already looking at some of the values that the organization is already thinking about doing. And then in that visibility bit, how would you suggest for someone to use that as a way to then approach somebody in a corporate or a SME, in terms of even language or how to dress for this coffee? Are there any tips or are there tips that that you're like, okay, don't do this? Like you already mentioned about don't ask for money on your first date for your coffee and pay for the coffee. And I guess, what else? I think it's very much, it seems like more like an art. It's not something that you can just put in. It's much more of a personal relationships, I suppose. Yeah. So I guess it's something that, if you can tell us a little bit more about what would be your tips on those.
Sure. All right. Okay, so let's first of all think of the place, right? Generally, think of a place you're going to meet this person that's nearer to them, right? They're generally going out on a coffee break or lunchtime or something like that. So you go, rather than trying to get them to come to you, you go to them, right? You're just going to make it a little bit easier for them to say yes to your offer. So that's number one. The second thing is about you ask questions about what to wear, all these type of things. I mean, at the end of the day, be yourself. Right. More often than not, these coffees that I've had with people working at the company, they are jealous of you because you get to do something that is meaningful for the community. They are jealous because or envious because you can have a different lifestyle than a 9-to-5 job, or they're constantly worried about making money for the company or something like that. So they're fascinated and intrigued by what you have to offer. So rather than trying to pretend to be something that you're not, just be yourself, and try not to. And maybe I'm projecting a little bit about myself here, but try not to kind of compare yourself to you and them. I mean, we've all made different choices in our lives about what we're pursuing, and we're often thinking that the grass is greener on the other side, and that works equally for you. They often see what you do as something that's much more interesting and exciting and valuable than what they're doing in their office or their company. So just be yourself, and as I said, be there, curious to hear about them. I have full confidence that whoever is going to these meetings knows enough about your organization to be able to share it. They're not asking for an analysis of your last year's funding. They just want to know the key bullet points about what your organization does, who it is that you're serving, and some of the challenges that you're facing. And that's about it. But at the end of the day, you're there to hear about that person, and you get the business, the market intel that you need to craft a proposal down the track. And that may seem a little bit kind of like secret agent, you're going undercover to find out about these things, but this is what the business world is about.
Oh, it's really fascinating to hear, Laurindo. You talked about how the grass is green on the other side, and NGOs, as seen from the corporate side, is seen like to be doing something more meaningful, or intrigued by what we do. And I guess people get that as a value that we can also offer to the corporate sector. You mentioned a little bit about ethics, because not all companies will be matching with the values of some of the NGOs around the world, in our region, particularly where it comes to, say, in countries where there is the homosexuality criminalization and other discrimination. How would you give advice in terms of navigating through those more difficult, challenging, ethics, particularly when they have to go back to their constituencies or their boards to talk about, the corporate funding is not going to be the silver bullet, but it will help in terms of the more sustainability with diverse sources of funding.
Yeah, great question. So ethics, and also having a clearer picture about the issues, or I guess the actions that your organization is prepared to do and not do. Having a conversation around those issues at the board level or with your senior leaders, I think is incredibly important, or even just your entire organization, right? before you going out there, having a conversation, perhaps a couple of, you do a little bit of a scenario play. Would we do a company? Would we work with a company that does this type of thing? Like cutting down rainforests, or going out there and working in countries that have criminalized being LGBT. Having those questions, having the conversation around those questions is incredibly helpful to guide the people doing the outreach in understanding what are the go, no-go areas. The reality is that there's no perfect company, nor is there any perfect community organization as well. None of us are doing a perfect job at everything, right? And while one community organization may say to themselves, we refuse to accept funding from a company that operates in a country that criminalizes LGBT, another community organization may also see that as an opportunity to get on the inside of that company and try and do the necessary work in there to help them understand the pros and cons of doing business that way. So again, it really comes down to what are your organization's priorities, and just work within that space. I would say, however, that many of the people working in those companies, particularly if they are gay themselves, are fully aware of what they're doing. And that's part of the reason why they are wanting to have a coffee with you in the first place, right there. Maybe they're wanting to get your perspective on what their company is from the outside, or they want to get maybe they feel guilty and they want to do something. I mean, there are many different reasons why they may be wanting to do outreach. Be aware that some companies may be wanting to use sponsorship as a way to make themselves look better after things that they've done in the past. And that could be, you could see that as a benefit, but you could also see that as something to be cynical about as well. So again, I skirted around that. I mean, I think that the point is that decision really rests with your board, your leadership team, about what you are prepared to do, but also understand that there's no perfect company, right? So you've got to manage your expectations as well.
But the message from you, I think, is clear in terms of having that organizational discussions, because it's not just about getting the money from private sector. It's actually about the whole organizational sustainability discussions about
that's right.
What do we want, right? This is going to be coming from, say, grants, and we want to invest some sort of time with, say, the corporates, and these are the corporates that we want to target, for example, as a way to kind of like move things forward.
Yep.
You also talked about the kind of getting the draft proposals as 2 pages. And I just wondered, like, in terms of the information that you need to contain in those, like, what would it contain? Because I think a lot of us are more used to sort of like, writing lots and lots of activities, right, for 1 year. And but 2-pager concept, what will actually catch their attention from the corporate perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I tell you, the first couple of corporate proposals I did in 2016 were still the UN level kind of proposals, like 10 pages, all these things. It was crazy. The budgets were ridiculous because you're projecting for every single thing. And that was a real learning. That was a real journey, kind of relearning how to do proposals. So the key subheadings that I've got in my proposals today are, the first thing, context. And context in terms of that company. What is the challenge that they are facing? And how do you assume you could address that? And I'm talking like 1 paragraph, right? The second piece after that is then the solution, right? So how are you proposing to respond to that context, right? And again, I'm just talking bullet points there. The third piece after that is then, what does the company stand to how does the company stand to benefit? So what are the key performance indicators of that proposal? And it could be, you know, more understanding, a greater understanding of its employees, deeper engagement if you're doing kind of a training thing, if you're offering access to your beneficiaries, and how many beneficiaries are you talking about? But basically, 3 top-level KPIs that you feel pretty confident that you can deliver. They could be just output metrics, they could be outcome metrics, whatever they may be. It's just things that just make what you're offering tangible, right? And so just those 3 bullet points. And then after that, it's your typical work plan, you know. What is the work plan? When do you propose that it could be done? And just break down that work plan into key milestones. And then that's it. And after that, you put a small blurb at the end of it with explaining a little bit about your organization in 1 or 2 paragraphs with links to the website or your social media page or something like that. And then the point is, you want them to, that's really just a calling card. You're wanting them to want to know more, right? And it's not like a proposal to the Global Fund or anything like that, where they're needing everything to justify the X amount of dollars. This is really intended to be a conversation starter, nor is it meant to be too vague either, right? You really want it to be precise, but brief.
Thanks, Laurindo. You also mentioned about you know, being ready for a lot of declines from the proposals, right? So you spend a lot of time buying the coffee, you know, near to their place, and then having these conversations. And at the end, you're like, okay, we don't have you know, CSR for particular areas that you're working in, or how do people deal with, you know, well, I guess maybe how do you deal with that rejections, I suppose, and multiple rejections, let's say, before you actually get the you know, the partner that want to really work with you?
Sure. I mean, there's 2 ways to think about it. I mean, it's all about building a thicker skin, right? So, okay, so first of all, I have learned to see a no as a good thing, right? Because, well, okay, let me kind of rewind a little bit. So first of all, it's not rejection per se. I mean, a good kind of thing in business that people say, particularly for people in sales, because this is kind of like what this is that it's not no, never, it's no for now, right? And that's not to say that they will say no in a year's time or 6 months' time or something like that. It's just no, not right now, right? So that's one way to kind of just take the edge off that no. The second thing is that another way to think about it is that it's good to get a no, because then you realize you're wasting your time, right? And that they're probably not the right fit for you. And it's better for you to just keep at it till you find that right partner, that right company who actually sees value in what you do, and because otherwise you're just wasting time. That was a piece of advice that I got from some other people who were teaching me how to do sales. So I think that's kind of a good way. I mean, it's never pleasant. And at the same time, I'm talking about all of these things and these processes and proposals and doing copy and all these things. It's also still very uncomfortable to be asking for money as well. That gets a little bit easier, but never goes away. And so I just want to acknowledge that. But at the end of the day, I'm speaking to the leaders in the room. If you don't ask for it, then who is going to, right? So somebody's going to do it, and there is cash out there. You just got to get out there.
Hmm. So when do you actually ask for money then? When you ask for that partnership, so you have one coffee, and then you could follow up with the 2-pager. But the 2-page, I guess, doesn't specify how much, right? Like what you asked.
It does. It does. By the time you're getting, well, okay. So there's two ways of doing things, and generally you got to, over time you'll kind of get a bit better at kind of figuring this out. But you could either offer a concept note,
right,
which has no money on it, but just kind of give them an idea about what you can offer or what they could do, or you could give them something with the financials on it as well. And it really depends on where they're at, right? So let's imagine you go there, you have a coffee with somebody, and they say to you, "Oh, look, we've never thought about that, but it sounds really interesting. Can you send me some details on what that might look like?" Right? And you, in the beginning, I thought, well, maybe in a conversation like that, it might be better just to give them a concept note with no financials. But I realized at the end of the day is that you've got one chance, oftentimes, to get your point across. And if you don't have at least all those essential informations about what is the value of that concept, then that tends to, it could be read as being a little bit too vague and airy-fairy. So these days I feel much more confident to go out there with that proposal with the financials, even if it's concept note, and because at least then the recipient has a better understanding of the value of what it is that you're proposing. Right?
Yeah. This is the last question from the list that you just went through. So
sure.
You mentioned about how the NGOs can also start creating kind of like values or programs that they can market to the corporates and SMEs. How could they go about thinking about, so for example, you talk about the lunch and learn. So how much you then charge us to say, okay, this will cost this much, and how to start building, I guess, a case for how much to charge corporates?
Sure. Good things. Good questions there. It's the eternal question about how much to charge. So what I have observed in the past is that community organizations have been hired by a company to do a lunch and learn session about what does LGBTQIA mean, or transgender, or so on, and then charge too little, right? So that's one thing. Another side of it is that community organizations have been invited to go in, and they are ready to charge, but the company says, "Oh, we have no money," right? So again, it really depends on the company. I think that the way to do it, first of all, is before you put in your proposal for that lunch and learn session, I'm sure your organization has already figured out what the cost per hour is for one of your consultants or for your organization to work as a whole, and let that be a starting point. And it's not just the time to go there physically, but also the preparation time as well, and kind of build that in, right? And then, because we're talking about the corporate sector, double it, triple it, right? Only to give yourself some room to move when the inevitable negotiation comes in, where they're saying, "Oh, we've only got this amount of budget," and it comes down. But basically, you're going to need to like these first 3 proposals, you're going to need to figure out what the market is for lunch and learn session. And the only way you can do that is by going a little bit higher, and then just doing a couple of them and figuring out what their paying is. At the same time, it's also sometimes a little bit arbitrary. Well, arbitrary in the sense that they're wanting a nice round number. Is it 1,000 US? Is it 500 US? Is it 10,000 baht or something like that? I mean, whatever the case may be. But it also works out to be round numbers at the end of the day. And the other factor is also, how much does your contact have the ability to sign off for, right? So they often have their own kind of parameters in terms of their own budgets. Employee resource groups have their own budgets as well. And so you kind of got to figure that out. But one thing that you could be asking in perhaps a follow-up to your coffee, your first coffee, where you're having a follow-up conversation with them. They're kind of telling you, hey, we're planning this for World Pride Month, right, in June, or for World AIDS Day or something like that. Is this something that you can help us with? And going, yeah, we can definitely offer you a talk, or we can work together to create some content for your company. And they, oh yeah, that sounds great. When you need it, blah blah blah. Have that conversation. And the conversation was, do you have any guidance on what budget you're kind of needing this to be within? And they'll often be upfront. They'll either tell you point blank, or they say, you know what, we don't know, so just go in there and ask for whatever you want, right? Again, it's kind of like when you're going to a wet market. You're be prepared to haggle, right? This is kind of what makes it a little bit more interesting than in the philanthropic space. Some people love this, other people hate it. Look for the people in your organization who love a good bargain, and then
yeah, for the shoppers, basically.
Exactly.
Laurindo, those are my questions. I don't know whether you have something else to kind of like present, because you stopped for the questions from the floor. But those are like the main ones. I just wonder whether you want to kind of like have other presentations that you have. I know it's coming to time now.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing, really, you covered some great questions there. Those are the perennial questions that come up. The only thing I would add there is kind of start small, and build from there. I've only been able to get to where I am right now in making lots of mistakes, first and foremost, but also just being there and just keep on coming back year after year, building that reputation over time with the organizations. Right now, I do very little social media visibility, not like the old days. And part of that is because I'm just too busy, but also I'm being much more specific. So I talked about LinkedIn earlier on. LinkedIn is the only platform where I do outreach these days, because I know that that's where all of the larger corporations are. And I think that there's something that I've got an opinion that I think that I want to contribute to those corporate conversations there. It's not all about trying to sell my services. It's also about trying to teach people and give people something to think about as they're doing their business day to day. Bear in mind, in LinkedIn, it's heavily dominated by people who are working HR, which is probably your entry point, and also recruiters, and some people trying to sell stuff too. But I think it's a good place. But don't assume that every company is on LinkedIn, because it's not. It's very much skewed to the multinationals there doing PR for their own corporations. But it's a good place to be learning about and getting a little bit of visibility, if that's what your organization is interested in doing. And that's it. Yeah, those are the main things. I mean, other than that, we covered a bit today about what are some of the challenges, the funding challenges that community organizations are facing, some strategies about how you might go about seeking funding from the private sector, and also try to cover some of the questions.
Well, thanks, Laurindo. I do have one more question, because as we know, like the reason why we're doing this, in this platform is because of COVID-19, right? Mm-hmm. So, is this a chance, or is there any opportunities to even start engaging with the private sector right now? We've been focused.
Right. Good question. I mean, I think that COVID-19 was definitely a reason for companies to number one, change the way that they do business, first and foremost. And some, it was a very negative outcome. Many, particularly smaller businesses had to shut down. But for the larger corporations, they also kind of really worked out what's important to them as well, and particularly on corporate value. So I do see that as an opportunity. But I think the bigger thing that is more relevant to the work that we do, and I say that in like the bigger APCOM family, is actually things like Black Lives Matter. I think that particularly if you're dealing with companies from Europe, the United States as well, is that Black Lives Matter did kind of shake up the way that companies are doing things and think of themselves as well, and they were forced to take a position. And that has then opened the doors for many community organizations who are promoting a more inclusive and more diverse and equitable world to really have some time and talk about the work that they do. So what I would say the opportunity is for community organizations in Asia is for them to kind of take a moment to consider the companies that are operating in their part of the world, and I would actually focus it on the multinationals. And what I've found is that you may have a tech company or a manufacturing company or a fashion brand who on their social media page are all about Black Lives Matter or all about LGBT or all of those types of things. But it tends to be very US-centric or Europe-centric or Australia-centric. And more often than not, they've got that global commitment, but they haven't done that work on the ground in Thailand, in India, in other parts of Southeast Asia as well. And there are people within that company, those regional counterparts are looking for ways to make good on that commitment in this part of the world. So that's an entry point. But there's a catch. The people who then need to implement that program in Thailand or in India or in Southeast Asia, they're generally employee volunteers. They're not doing it full time. They're probably doing their day job on top of their day-to-day job. And so they'll be looking for quick wins, which is great. If you've got a lunch and learn or something like that, that's ready to go. They don't need to think about it. But they're also, oftentimes there's lots of delays involved because they're not doing this as their full-time job, right? So they have to go to the head office to try and find the cash and all these types of things. So while there are opportunities here, the cadence, the ability to move very fast is often challenged because these people have got other competing commitments at the same time. But there's still definitely opportunities.
Great, thanks so much, Laurindo, and thanks so much everyone for tuning in. You, Laurindo, and everyone else who's here with us online. This is the opening of a 5-day APCOM Community Summit 2020, and Laurindo has kicking us off with the session on engaging the private sector for funding, what you need to know, and we have so much tips and so much, I think, courage in terms of where we are making the first step to go into the unknowns. And there are even opportunities during COVID-19 to do that, particularly when everyone else is going through some unknowns as well. So I think this is a good time.
Yeah. Just a shout out.
Sure.
Just a quick shout out. This Thursday, I'll be releasing a white paper. My organization will be releasing a white paper. We've conducted an analysis on what programs or activities that companies should think about doing if they want to make their organization more inclusive and create a sense of belonging. And in this white paper, we talk about some key activities. And if you or any of the other RAPCON participants are interested to have a look at that, it may be helpful for you to kind of consider, well, these are some things that my organization could offer to this company. So if you want to get access to that white paper, just shoot me an email or sign up on our mailing list at b-inclusive.com.
Great. And then, of course, yeah, we'll love to learn more from you as well, Laurindo, and then we can also then put this out as a package on the fundraising as a part of this week APCOM Community Summit as well.
Okay, can do.
Thank you so much, Laurindo. And stay tuned, people. We will have another session at 12 noon Bangkok time. So see you all later. Yep. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Laurindo.
Bye-bye.